just can't keep it. You bless me, Lord.
A Sunday service at New Covenant Baptist Church of Orlando, Florida, and LaVon Bracey, the pastor's wife, was about to address the congregation again on her favorite topic.
What am I going to talk about? Voting. We're going to vote early.
Voting has been on Bracey's mind a lot lately. She admits she's a partisan Democrat and a big fan of the president. And so both in and out of church, she works as a one-woman voter registration drive.
You know what precinct?
She carries registration forms with her wherever she goes, so she can buttonhole diners enjoying after-church meals at a soul food restaurant, or badger residents of a local seniors complex.
Just trying to see if there's some new residents that I have not registered to vote.
Almost daily, she trundles across Orlando to the Orange County Supervisor of Elections office to drop off piles of completed forms.
We've added so many.
Yeah.
Bracey has been registering Orlando area voters for years, and she says it used to be a pretty straightforward process.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
But she says it got more difficult last year when Florida's Republican-controlled legislature passed a bill that made scores of changes to the state's election rules.
It streamlines the ballot. It protects voters from intimidation. It improves access to update your voter registration.
Voting rights groups said some aspects of the bill, which were intended to prevent alleged voter fraud, simply made it more difficult to register and vote. It required volunteers who wanted to register voters to themselves register with the state. It required those volunteers to precisely note the time and date of each registration, and to submit completed forms to county officials within 48 hours rather than the 10 days that the old rules allowed.
The more you have signed registration applications out there floating around and not being turned in, the more chance for mischief and mishap.
This is January, February.
LaVon Bracey says the upshot is that the bill made registering voters more difficult for volunteers like her who work in Democratic-leaning communities. And she believes that's exactly what the bill's Republican supporters had in mind.
They want to make certain that the state of Florida is not blue but red. And I think that this law was purposely put in place so that Barack Obama would be a one-term president.
The bill also laid out penalties for volunteers like Bracey if they made mistakes during the registration process, fines of up to $1,000, or even felony charges.
Were you concerned at all that you might face liability under the law?
Absolutely. But I just refused to be intimidated to the point that I would do nothing.
The 64-year-old former advocate for the homeless says she learned that lesson as a kid. Her father was a minister and president of a local chapter of the NAACP. She enrolled as one of the first black students at her Florida high school, where she says she was beaten and ostracized.
You got by just being silent because you had no voice. It made such an indelible impression on me that I would say never again will I ever remain silent when I can make a difference.
Time to get registered. You registered to vote?
Across town on the campus of the University of Central Florida, members of the college Democrats let students know about another change to the state's voter registration law.
Make sure your address is updated, okay? Is your address updated as well?
Florida Republicans made it more difficult for voters to file last-minute changes of address. Democrats worry that could end up disenfranchising students who move from year to year and who tend to support Democratic candidates. A difference of even a few votes on the UCF campus could have national effects because the university sits in the I-4 corridor that runs from Daytona on the Atlantic coast through Orlando to Tampa on the Gulf Coast.
That's Interstate 4 down there. The highway cuts the state of Florida in half. On one side of it, to the north, the majority of Floridians vote Republican. On the other side, to the south, the majority vote Democratic. So the balance of political power in Florida is here in Orlando and in the counties along I-4. You can think of them as being the swing counties in a swing state that could determine the outcome of the election.
Not a person in this room wants to prevent an eligible voter from voting.
Dennis Baxley is the state legislator who introduced the bill that changed Florida's rules for voter registration. He's a Republican who lives north of I-4 in the red part of the state. He says he introduced the bill because the state's electorate is so closely divided.
I think it's very naive to think that people don't try to stuff things in the ballot box. How can you take the position of defending the vote of dead people and ineligible voters?
I think a lot of us outside of Florida, we think back to 2000, it wasn't necessarily a registration problem. It was poor ballot design, it was problems with the counting. So why focus on the registration side?
People ask me this question and I would just say, can you spell acorn?
Acorn was the now defunct community organizing group that got in trouble for accepting hundreds of fraudulent registration forms in the Orlando area in 2008, like this one.
We know in Orange County, an Acorn worker tried to register Mickey Mouse. We also know that Mickey Mouse was never going to show up at the polls. But you talk about dead voters, ineligible voters, how much evidence of that is there?
Well, why should we wait? I mean, do we have to wait until there's a forest fire before we take appropriate precautions? Government's constantly criticized for waiting until there's a crisis before they act. Don't wait until you have a constitutional crisis.
A study by a group called News 21 suggests that only about 1 in 15 million ballots nationally can be ascribed to fraud on the part of voters. And that in Florida since 2000 there have only been 39 documented cases of it, which is a tiny, tiny portion.
It doesn't have to be something that's broken. It's about securing the system before you have a breakdown.
But the League of Women Voters and Rock the Vote worried that Baxley's bill exposed their volunteers to fines or criminal charges. They suspended their Florida registration drives and filed suit. Over the summer, a federal court tossed out some of the most restrictive provisions, and volunteers for the league fanned out across the state to play catch-up.
Thank you very much indeed.
Baxley says a recent criminal investigation of a Republican consulting firm for allegedly ginning up fraudulent registrations shows that his bill is working.
Right now, of all ironies, the Republican Party of Florida has just fired a vendor because they had a bad person doing stuff, but they were able, because of this accountability, to track that problem down early. It's checks and balances, and it doesn't matter who you are.
Another part of Baxley's bill eliminated early voting on the Sunday before Election Day. That's when Florida's black churches ran an event called Souls to the Polls. Churchgoers would pile onto buses after services and head to polling places. Some African-American leaders in Florida say that in 2008, the event helped Barack Obama win the state. And they say the decision to conclude early voting on the Saturday before Election Day smacks of racism. State Representative Dennis Baxley says he was simply trying to give elections officials more time to get ready for Election Day, and he bristles when his motives are questioned.
I think their view is racist, that some people have to be handled differently and they don't know how to participate. No, the process is open to everybody. I don't treat somebody different because of their race.
Baxley worries that events like Souls to the Polls don't put enough emphasis on how serious voting is.
You know, I do hold the view that it is a responsibility, and that we need to do more than just hand somebody a pony card and stuff them in a bus and dump them out at the polls. That is not fully participating in our election process.
Last year, Florida's GOP governor, Rick Scott, made yet another change to the state's election rules, which makes voting more difficult for residents who've served time for felonies. Florida is one of just 4 states that prohibit all ex-felons from voting unless they've had their rights restored by a clemency board. The new rule requires them to wait 5 to 7 years before they can even apply for the right to cast a ballot.
Felons seeking restoration of rights will also be required to demonstrate that they deserve clemency only after they have shown they're willing to abide by the law.
According to one study, 23% of black Floridians of voting age can't vote because of the rule. That's nearly 1 in 4 in the same boat as Orlando's Vicki Hankins.
As soon as I got out, I applied for my civil rights. You know which one I'm talking about?
She spent nearly 2 decades in a federal prison for a nonviolent drug offense. After she was released, she put out a book, started her own publishing company, and launched a magazine. She went to college. She waited more than 2 years while her application to have her rights restored languished at the state capitol. And then she heard Governor Scott had changed the rules and received this email telling her that she'd have to wait even longer.
What that says to me is no matter what you've done, Vicki, we don't care about the example that you've set. We do not care that you spent 20 years in prison. We do not care that you paid your debt to society. You are not a part of us. That's what that says.
Is there anything at all to this argument that maybe some people who've been incarcerated, maybe we do need to wait a little while to see, make sure that they're not going to reoffend, make sure that they're not going to go back to a life of crime before we let them vote?
Here's the issue with that. It should not be all of these people under this one umbrella. There are a lot of people who are trying to give back to society. So for those people, Governor Scott, that decision doesn't add up.
Orlando voting activist LaVon Bracey says the GOP-backed changes to Florida voting law haven't discouraged her. She's planning to keep working to get out the vote until the polls close on Election Day. And she hopes the new rules help motivate voters.
Don't get discouraged, get mad. And get mad enough that you go out to vote.
Republican State Representative Dennis Baxley says that's fine with him.
Maybe my controversy has actually excited people to actually figure out I've got a wonderful right and privilege, but it's also a very serious responsibility I should go ahead and embrace. So if anything good came out of the controversy, I hope that's it.